So Elizabeth Reese is going to be talking about the Marquis de Lafayette and his return visit in 1824 and 25 to the National Capital Region. Let me tell you a little bit about Elizabeth. She has been an interpreter at federal historic sites for a decade. Over a decade, yeah. And you can see much of it on the screen, but what we also know is that she is a fabulous speaker because she was invited to speak at Arlington House in October to begin the celebration of the 200th anniversary of the Marquis visiting the United States, the brand new United States. And she will talk about the message that he was bringing and how he really wanted us to take a look at what we had done and how far we had come and how far we needed to go in 1824 and 1825. So I'll let you read the rest. I hope you buy her book. Thank you so much for coming tonight.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Annette, for that lovely introduction, and everyone here at Arlington Historical Society for inviting me tonight, and all of you in the audience here for braving the cold and the somewhat treacherous roads that we've had to be here tonight. I am thrilled to speak to you about my book, The Marquis de Lafayette Returns, as well as Lafayette's 1824-1825 tour of America. Lafayette's national tour was a monumental moment in American history, and it was a true cultural event. It is estimated that millions upon millions of Americans came out to greet him over the course of this 13-month tour. During this time, Lafayette traveled to each of the 24 states. He went across over 6,000 miles, taking part in hundreds of parades, ceremonies, and was bestowed with countless toasts, honors, awards, and poems. In Alexandria, Virginia, there was a man named, he was an educator named Benjamin Hallowell. He had gotten married very shortly before Lafayette's visit, and he took the time to pen a poem about the Lafayette pandemonium. Say that 5 times fast. He wrote that each lover of liberty surely must get something in honor of Lafayette. There's a Lafayette watch chain and a Lafayette hat, a Lafayette this and a Lafayette that. But I wanted something as lasting as life, and I took to myself a Lafayette wife. At first glance, one might hear this poem as something quite silly. He's equating his entire marriage to a simple Lafayette souvenir, but Hallowell's mention of souvenirs in this poem is something a little bit more than just a convenient rhyme. From August of 1824 to September of 1825 and beyond, no American was spared from Lafayette fever. When I began my research, the souvenirs produced in the wake of Lafayette's tour were the first thing that came to the forefront, because if you wanted something, anything, with Lafayette's face on it in the early 19th century, chances are that you could get it. There were ribbons, pottery, plates, smoking pipes, gloves, snuff boxes, and even Lafayette watch chains and Lafayette hats, as Hallowell mentioned. You name it, Lafayette's face was on it and sold. Even in the years following Lafayette's tour, these items continued to be advertised in American newspapers. Merchants across America were advertising a further supply of Lafayette ware, along with tea sets gold-edged and a view of Mount Vernon well into the 1820s. Even though Lafayette at that time was long gone from our shores, Americans still looked for tangible memories of his visit. And there are thousands of these pieces that have sat in private collections and public archives for centuries. Each item was not only purchased by someone, but it was saved and preserved through generations, really reinforcing what Lafayette meant to Americans and what he meant to the generations that followed. And fortunately, we're now celebrating Lafayette, the bicentennial of Lafayette's tour, and a lot of these pieces are on display at cultural institutions and museums, especially here in the DC area. But as I continued to research, these souvenirs continued to stay with me for a multitude of reasons. One, the sheer number and variety of these items meant that the demand for Lafayette was almost universal, and it was very long-lasting. Two, these pieces meant that the concept of people wanting a physical item as a memory of an event, it's not a new concept. We're pretty used to like merch today, but people were doing it 200 years ago too. And three, it meant that Lafayette meant something very important to Americans in the early 19th century. And when I set out on this research, I thought that was going to be the easiest, simplest answer, something along the lines that, well, of course, he was a hero of the American Revolution. Of course, he was important. And while that is a very large part of the reason why his return was important, I soon discovered he meant something a lot more. Because Lafayette returned to America at a time of deep political division. His arrival brought Americans together, if only for a brief moment, and it left a legacy so lasting it remains to this day, 200 years later. I have worked in this field for a decent amount of time, and I can truthfully say that there has been no figure that has made people whipped into a frenzy in like the 21st century like Lafayette has. And I worked at Alexander Hamilton's house during the musical, so that's saying something. So when we think of Lafayette, this is probably how we're picturing him. We picture him as this young, dashing, wealthy hero in a military uniform who volunteered to fight for America. And because Lafayette is not a figure that we know as well as maybe George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, it's kind of helpful to do a very brief biographical sketch of who this man was. He was born into the French noble class, and he was enraptured when he first heard the news of what was happening in the American colonies. At the age of 19, he sailed across the Atlantic and knocked on the door of Congress to pledge his service. But Lafayette was not the only French noble who was looking to assist the American cause. Unlike many of his countrymen, though, many of them were really only seeking a title and payment. Lafayette was, in his own words, here to learn, not teach. He soon proved his bravery on the battlefield. He won over the famously stoic George Washington, who was initially a little unimpressed with the inexperienced Frenchman. The two men became extremely close over the course of the war, and when Lafayette was shot in the leg during the Battle of Brandywine, Washington told those overseeing his care to, quote, care for him as if he were my own son. In all, Lafayette spent over $200,000 of his own money on the American cause, which included purchasing uniforms and muskets for his men during the bitter winter encampment at Valley Forge. Though it was not his efforts alone, he was instrumental in binding France's allegiance to America, and throughout the entire war, Lafayette served without pay. In fact, he was helping to fund the war. When Lafayette returned to France in the 1780s, Americans saw him as a hero. He was a selfless soldier who was instrumental to the victory at Yorktown and helping to end the war. And so after the Revolution, Lafayette returned to France with the expectation that his experience serving in the American Revolution would help bring about the ideas of liberty and equality back to his home country. Unfortunately, though, in his absence, the French monetary support of the American Revolution was depleting France's finances, and it drove further divisions between the French royals and nobles and then the common people. So as Lafayette was returning to France, his country was on the cusp of their own revolution. He still supported the idea of a monarchy, though he was hopeful France would evolve to a constitutional monarchy where people still had representation and a voice. And having this stance of a constitutional monarchy in the beginnings of the French Revolution is really not a popular choice to have. And he quickly found himself torn between two sides: the aristocracy, which he was a member of, and the common people. And as the terror began to escalate, nobles especially were targeted. Realizing that the blade of the guillotine was likely his fate, Lafayette fled from France with the hopes of coming here to America. He was captured en route, though, and he was imprisoned in Prussia and Austria for 5 years, from 1792 to 1797. Upon his release from prison, Lafayette took a brief step back from politics, partially due to the rise of Napoleon. Napoleon was helpful in getting Lafayette out of prison, and that is the beginning and end of any friendship and cordial relationship these two men had. They did not like each other at all, and more largely due to the health of his wife, Adrienne. After Adrienne died in 1807, Lafayette returned to politics, and he continues this almost rabid advocacy for liberty and equality, which really becomes this driving force throughout his life. It does not make him the most popular man in France. So by the time of the 1820s, Lafayette was tolerated at best. He was broke. All of his land holdings and finances were stripped during his imprisonment during the French Revolution, and he was really ready for a change of pace. So over here across the ocean, America was in a similar but a little bit different position. By 1824, although America was still a country very much in her infancy, the idea of what America would be and how its founding especially would be remembered was very much on the minds of its citizens. In fact, the mythology of the founding generation, it even starts to begin when these men are still alive. John Adams writes about this in a 1790 letter to Benjamin Rush, where he writes, "The history of our revolution will be continued live from one end to the other. The essence of the whole will be that Dr. Franklin's electrical rod smote the earth and out sprung George Washington. That Franklin electrified him, and thenceforth these two conducted all the policy, negotiation, legislation, and war." So they're pretty aware of how people were probably going to remember the revolution. In 1824, in addition with grappling with this kind of founding mythology, America's mind was heading towards the upcoming 50th anniversary celebrations of the Declaration of Independence and America's birthday. This landmark birthday was an opportunity, as most landmark birthdays are, to look back and celebrate. But after years of war and political division, patriotism and unity were waning, and it really did not seem that many were in this celebratory mood. The nation was under the presidency of James Monroe, here he is, during this time, who was first elected in 1816. This is in the aftermath of the War of 1812, and Monroe wanted to continue a sense of national unity. It's not until the War of 1812 that Americans start viewing themselves as Americans. Prior to this, you saw yourself as a Virginian, a Pennsylvanian, a New Yorker, and it's through the War of 1812, which is kind of another residual war from the American Revolution, that Americans start seeing themselves united. So Monroe really, really wants to continue this. And he views political parties as the source of division in the country. Now, while partisan politics were something he was looking to avoid, political resentment massively grew under his administration. If you know there's an issue happening and you choose to ignore it, wounds tend to fester. That's kind of what's happening during Monroe's administration. You may hear his administration referred to as the era of good feelings, and some people joke it's actually the era of bad feelings because they weren't feeling that great. As party factions grew, the Federalist Party actually collapses under his administration, and the idea of who is going to lead this country into this kind of non-founder future is beginning to take shape. So in the hopes of stirring up some fervor and excitement, Monroe looks across the Atlantic to a hero who is still very much alive and beloved, and this man is Lafayette. Monroe's connections to Lafayette is not just a simple thread of American patriotism. When Monroe served as the American minister to France, he and his wife, Elizabeth Courtwright, were instrumental in saving Lafayette's wife, Adrienne, during the Terror. Many members of Adrienne's family were imprisoned and executed, and Adrienne herself was imprisoned and scheduled for her own execution, and the Monroes worked with French officials to spare her life the day before her execution was scheduled. So they have a kind of a long history between these two men. In 1824, though, Lafayette is the last surviving major general of the American Revolution, and he is one of the last links to George Washington, at least in a military sense. There are definitely other links to George Washington, which we will talk about in this presentation too. Lafayette was respected, he was revered, and he was loved by Americans. So if invoking the memory of Washington and the founding of the nation and the Franco-American alliance was not enough to bring the nation together, then really what could? So in February of 1824, Monroe wrote to Lafayette inviting him to America for a visit of celebration. Lafayette quickly agreed and a plan was set into motion. Lafayette booked passage on his ship, and he arranged for his son, George Washington Lafayette, along with his personal secretary, Auguste Levasseur, to travel with him. And it was on August 15th, 1824, when Lafayette once again stepped onto American soil for the first time in 40 years upon his landing at Staten Island, New York. The very next day, he sailed across the harbor to Castle Clinton at the southernmost tip of Manhattan, which is depicted here in this. This is a mid-19th century painting. This isn't really contemporary to Lafayette's actual visit, but it is a good job of kind of showing the frenzy. At Castle Clinton, about 50,000 people lined the streets waiting to welcome him. The population of New York City at the time was 150,000. So that is a significant chunk of the New York City population coming out just for Lafayette. Lafayette's secretary, Levasseur, kept a detailed journal of his travels, and his description of the New York crowd was as follows. The cannon thundered from the shore, in the forts, and from all the vessels of war. On our way, all the streets were decorated with flags and drapery, and from all the windows, flowers and wreaths were showered upon the general. This scene would be impressive alone for just Lafayette's first time back to America in almost a half of a century. But what was remarkable is that this scene, as Levasseur describes, is going to be repeated almost every single day for the next 13 months of Lafayette's tour. Large cities, towns, just some small towns that Lafayette is passing through would replicate this pageantry of appreciation. Because wherever Lafayette was, the crowds were going to follow. This is my absolute favorite image of Lafayette's tour. This is a contemporary image, unlike the one that we saw in the previous slide. And you can see Lafayette in an open coach with the crowd racing towards him. I don't know if you can see, can you see my mouse? Yes, you can, okay. These two guys with the hats are fun, just looking like they're trying to get his attention. And then the smoke is from the cannon fire, and then up in the windows, you can see people just kind of hoping to get a quick little glimpse of him. We don't know who the artist is who did this piece. We're not really sure exactly where this was, but you can certainly see that Levasseur's words from New York are reflected here in this image. Lafayette's tour was one of the first documented cases of tourism on such a massive scale here in America, with a single event, or really in this case, single person, driving groups of people to travel outside of their homes. When you think about travel in the 1820s during this time, most people don't travel outside of their homes. They live very close by because your options are by foot, horseback, carriage or coach, or the brand new invention is a steamboat, but you need water for that. So you're pretty limited in how you can travel. So the fact that we can see documented that in smaller cities, the number of people who were there to see Lafayette at certain events outnumbered the population of the town is showing that people are moving with the chance of just seeing him. Not like moving home, but like tourism, temporary movement for a visit. When Lafayette spent the winter of 1824 and 1825 here in the Washington, D.C. area, there were temporary lodging houses and boardings and taverns saw maximum capacity in an otherwise pretty quiet time during the year. And that was all just for the chance of like, maybe they'd see him at the theater, maybe they'd see him at a party, maybe they'd see him walking down the street, but there was no guarantee. The New York Mirror and Ladies Literary Gazette wrote about this on August 21st, 1824, that gentlemen are ready to throw by their business to shake him by the hand, and ladies forget their lovers to dream of him. If a man asks, "Have you seen him?" you know who he means. Lafayette's national tour brought Americans together in a way that was unprecedented really before or after. The fact that he was nearly universally beloved may have been largely due in part to the fact that the French Revolution kept him in France. Shortly after Lafayette's release from his 5-year imprisonment, America entered the quasi-war with France in 1798. Although compared to other entanglements between countries, very little blood was shed, it left strained relations between these two powers. And Lafayette wrote to his friends in America about the possibility of seeking asylum, and he was really encouraged not to come. In a letter to Lafayette, Alexander Hamilton wrote that he feared offering Lafayette safe haven would strike up further tension with France, and it was really in America's best interest to stay out of the issue. And it's kind of a really mean letter, especially when you think that these two men were so close during the war. Hamilton writes, "I have never been able to believe that France can make a republic, and I have believed that the attempt, while it continues, can only produce misfortunes. I give you this assurance on the faith of our former friendship." Kind of showing where Hamilton, who was very anti-France during this time, is kind of coming from. He won't even make an exception for Lafayette. But despite these harsh words, Hamilton's letter closes with a sentiment that would define Lafayette's legacy for decades to come. That despite constant infighting, quote, "the only thing in which our parties agree is to love you." Hamilton was correct, though I argue it was very unintentional of what he was saying and kind of the meaning and weight of his words. But early American politics were bitterly torn apart by Federalist and Democratic Republicans, and by remaining outside the fray, Lafayette was never forced to choose a side, and therefore remaining a politically neutral figure, and remaining a politically beloved figure when he comes back 40 years later. So Lafayette spent August to September. He was traveling throughout the Northeast, visiting New York, Boston, West Point, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. He celebrated the 47th anniversary of the Battle of Brandywine in New York with French residents. He visited the Emma Willard School for Women. He visited with President John Adams at his home and stopped at the African Free School in Lower Manhattan. And that is like the highlight tour of the very first couple months. Every single day he was visiting someone, multiple people, multiple stops. But he first arrived in the city of Washington on October 12th, 1824. Only recently established, by this time, about 13,000 people called Washington home. And so the city that we know today with the neoclassical structures and the large sweeping avenues is really far from reality. Having just been feted in the city of Baltimore, a city that was much more established, Baltimore was also a huge arts and cultural center during this time. It also had a massive French population. Auguste Lavoisier was largely unimpressed with the city of Washington, and he wrote in his journal that drawn on a gigantic scale, the plan of Washington cannot be filled out for a century. So it was pretty sparse in their opinion, especially for a capital city. But it's important to know that Washington was also a city that was devastated by the War of 1812. And in August of 1814, the Capitol and the White House were both burned. And 10 years later, the city is still rebuilding. This is the Capitol building from the west side. This is the side that kind of faces the National Mall. This is where inaugurations take place this day on the west side. But this is how the Capitol looked in 1824. Looks really different than how we picture the Capitol building today. The Capitol was largely expanded throughout the 19th century, but the building that Lafayette saw is considerably smaller, and perhaps the biggest difference is the dome. This is the first Capitol dome. It was made of wood and copper, and it was completed in anticipation of Lafayette's visit. So if you visit the Capitol building, and if you stand in the rotunda, the floor of the rotunda and the walls before it hits the cast iron dome, that is the original sandstone floor, and you are standing on the same ground that Lafayette once did. That's one of the oldest pieces of this part of the Capitol building. When Lafayette entered Washington in a large procession, he was greeted by members of the military and citizens on the other side of the Capitol, which is the front of the building. And while Washingtonians came out to see him, there was also a gift in turn for them. This portrait was done by the artist Ari Scheffer, and it was given as a gift to Congress during Lafayette's tour. The portrait was placed in the rotunda for the majority of Lafayette's entire 13-month tour before it was moved later to the House chamber. Throughout the tour, Lafayette understandably received an overwhelming amount of requests from artists to sit for portraits. This is a major event. Every artist wants to have the opportunity to paint him. And his time was incredibly limited, and he was only able to honor, I think, one of those requests. So instead, artists would travel to Washington to view the painting in the rotunda in lieu of having the ability of having the subject sit for them themselves. So if you notice that a lot of these portraits of Lafayette around like the 19th century, the 1820s, they all kind of look the same. It's because they kind of are. They're all using this as their reference point. The portrait Lafayette of Lafayette that was gifted to the nation was moved from the rotunda to the old House chamber. It's a room known today as National Statuary Hall. And when the House moved to their new chamber in 1857, the portrait followed, and it still remains in the House chamber to this day. So when you watch congressional proceedings or the State of the Union, Lafayette is always there. This placement has a pretty important meaning. On December 10th, 1824, Lafayette was the first foreign dignitary to address Congress. To this day, he is the only private non-citizen to address the chamber. In addition to the recognition of his services during the Revolution, Congress also gave him $200,000, essentially a repayment of what he had spent during the Revolution, and a land grant near present-day Tallahassee, Florida. He did not move to Florida, and he did not become an American resident, unfortunately, and he ended up selling off that land. So back to his first visit to the Capitol, after a brief ceremony and a quick tour, he boarded a carriage and he headed down Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House, where President Monroe was waiting to greet him. During their meeting, Monroe told Lafayette that he had originally intended for his guest to use the White House as his primary residence during his time in the city, but Washingtonians protested. Monroe says that the people of Washington claim you. They say you are the nation's guest, and nobody other than themselves has the right to house you. because Lafayette becomes a fixture in Washington, as I kind of briefly mentioned before, during the winter of 1824 and 1825. When the cold weather set in and travel becomes a lot more difficult, I'm sure we can relate to that with the storm that we've just had, Lafayette made Washington his home base. He does travel nearby. He has some short trips to Baltimore and Annapolis, but he largely remains in Washington and attends dinner parties. He goes to the theater and he visits with friends nearby. Lafayette was at the White House very often, despite not using it as his residence. He was there quite often during his time in Washington. He dined frequently with the Monroe family, but at nearly every opportunity, he visited the Custis grandchildren nearby. And in fact, on the very first night he was in Washington, he was welcomed to the very large diplomatic dinner at the White House. There were dignitaries, there were 34 toasts to the nation, and Lafayette requested permission to retire early so that he could have the opportunity to, quote, pay his respects to some intimate and respected friends, the connection of the family of the late George Washington in Georgetown. Lafayette's objective was to visit Patty Custis Peter at her home, Tudor Place. And despite having a long day, keep in mind, Lafayette was traveling by carriage from Baltimore to Washington. He visited and toured the Capitol. He met with Monroe. He had this massive dinner in his honor. He insisted on prioritizing the Custises, the closest remaining familial link to his relationship with George Washington. At Tudor Place, Lafayette was reunited with Patty and her children before bidding them adieu and stopping a few blocks away to visit Patty's older sister, Eliza, at her town home nearby. From the start of his time in Washington, Lafayette made it very, very clear that the time spent with the Custis family was most important and precious to him. A few days later, on October 15th, it was time for Lafayette to visit George Washington Parke Custis at Arlington House. Lafayette had spent the morning and afternoon at the Washington Navy Yard. Again, he dines with Monroe at the White House. And so by the time he sets out to visit Custis at Arlington House, the sun was beginning to set. And even so, as darkness was quickly approaching, George Washington Parke Custis, we'll just call him Wash from here on out, because it's such a mouthful of a name. Wash was insistent on making Arlington House dazzle. Instead of these really impressive views that you would see at Arlington House, which you can still see today during the daytime, with expansive lawns, sheep, you don't see the sheep anymore, tree nuts and sweeping views of the city, he decided to illuminate the home with candles in each window and throughout the central hall, setting the most, as he later wrote, sublime and imposing scene. And these efforts really seemed to work. Auguste Lavoisier, who mentioned before, he's not easily impressed. He wrote upon his first sight of Arlington House that his house, built on a scaled down plans of the Temple of Theseus, stands on one of the most beautiful sites that one could imagine. When Lafayette arrived, Wash formally welcomed him to his home at the portico before leading the group inside the parlor to introduce him to the guests that were waiting for him. His Molly Custis presented Lafayette with a rose that had been picked from Mount Vernon that very morning. And one wonders what Lafayette must have thought when he entered Arlington House, which was presented almost as a shrine to the memory of George Washington. After Martha Washington's death, many of the belongings and items that had decorated Mount Vernon were divided up among the 4 Custis grandchildren. The items that adorned the walls at Arlington House, that hung from the ceiling, that filled the tabletops, were all pieces that Lafayette would have known when he visited Mount Vernon in 1784. Despite the later hour, another large meal was prepared, but Lafayette politely refused, instead accepted just one black coffee for sipping. And it was apparent that Lafayette was exhausted, but he really, really wanted to give the Custis family their time with him. They conversed together for a few hours, and Wash later wrote, quote, there was a smile of delight on every countenance. A few days later, Lafayette returned to Mount Vernon for the first time since his last visit in 1784 to pay his respects to George Washington. So in the morning, he left from the city of Alexandria by steamship, and he traveled down the Potomac. And when the ship docked at Mount Vernon, he was greeted by Lawrence Lewis, who is George Washington's nephew, who was serving as host. Lawrence had married Martha's granddaughter, Nellie, one of the Custis grandchildren, and their family lived at Woodlawn, which is only 3 miles away from Mount Vernon. Lafayette first entered the tomb alone to pay his respects, before inviting his son and Lavoisier inside with him. And Lavoisier later wrote that despite he personally had never met George Washington, he was overwhelmed with the emotion that he witnessed and found himself soon weeping. When the three men left the tomb, Wash presented Lafayette with a gift, a small gold ring with a lock of Washington's hair. The fact that this moment happened really early on during the tour was really important for Lafayette. It allowed him closure to mourn for this man that he viewed as a father figure. Washington died in 1799, so Lafayette does not have this opportunity to physically mourn him at Mount Vernon for 25 years later. And it also reignited this connection that Washington and Lafayette shared. After the visit to Mount Vernon, there was a surge of words and imagery invoking the memory of Washington and the friendship that they had, and really, really reignited that Lafayette is this like symbol of Washington, it's this symbol of the war and the last living remnant of kind of what Washington stood for. Now, although it wasn't inherently political, Lafayette's visit had massive political implications. The election of 1824, which is between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, was one of the most tumultuous in American history. While politics were divisive across the nation, tensions in Washington, as is with any election year, were especially at an all-time high. This election was the first where none of the candidates had served in the Revolution or had a hand in the nation's founding documents. So without the rose-colored memories of the founders to guide voters, the nation was really at a crossroads. What was the path for the future of the presidency? Was it reserved only for those connected to the family names of the Revolution, like John Quincy Adams, or would America be a country where the common man could rule, someone like Andrew Jackson? The race saw four primary candidates. You had Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and William Crawford, but the campaign was so fractious that no candidate had won enough electoral votes to win, which forced the House of Representatives to select the next president. Jackson had secured the popular vote, and he held the majority of the electoral votes, which left him pretty confident that he kind of had the job in the bag. Instead, on February 9th, 1825, the House elected Adams as the sixth president of the United States. And the choice enraged Jackson's supporters, who claimed that what would later be known as a corrupt bargain had taken place, orchestrated by these lobbying efforts of one of the four candidates, Henry Clay. When Clay accepted Adams's offer to be Secretary of State, then, which was a natural stepping stone to the presidency, we don't really see that path to the presidency anymore, but in the early 19th century it was, this was a choice that further outraged Jackson's supporters. Lafayette was present in the House chamber on February 9th when John Quincy Adams was selected as the president. And that evening, President Monroe hosted a reception at the White House where Lafayette and John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson were all in attendance. And Lafayette was witness to the first public moment that the new president-elect and the man that he defeated had. Jackson had a little bit of a reputation. People didn't really know what was going to happen. And when they heard that Jackson would also be attending this reception, people were kind of hanging around because they didn't know what he was going to say or do. And to the delight or the chagrin of many, upon his entrance, Jackson immediately made his way to his opponent to clasp his hand in his own and congratulations. And perhaps no one was more relieved than Adams, who the newspapers wrote appeared profoundly moved by the gesture. I think it was probably more a sign of relief. Lafayette's arrival seemed to be a magic balm for what newspapers called the electoral zeal that enveloped the nation. He did not sway politics by personally endorsing a candidate, but people really seemed to behave when he was around. There were politicians who were, this may be hard for us to imagine, engaged in screaming matches on the floor of Congress the day before, and even challenging each other to fisticuffs, later sitting side by side at Lafayette's table, raising a toast to him and the future prosperity of the nation. He had this ability to bring people together in a way that I think is very, very difficult to wrap our modern minds around because politics work so differently these days. And a large part of this is what Hamilton wrote in his letter all those years ago. The only thing in which our parties agree is to love you. Now, he was very aware of this bipartisan popularity that he had. He could have easily rested on his laurels and just coasted along in a 13-month wonderful tour celebrating himself. But what he does is he uses this popularity to his advantage. Throughout his career, Lafayette held passionate anti-slavery views, and he was not blind to the presence of slavery here in America. Throughout his personal correspondence and public appearance during the national tour, Lafayette frequently went out of his way to acknowledge free and enslaved men who had aided him during his time in America. One of these men was a man named James Armistead, who was an enslaved soldier who in the Revolution worked as a double agent to the benefit of the Americans. He would feed the British false information and he would relay that intelligence back to Lafayette. Armistead volunteered his services in 1781 with the distinct request of serving Lafayette personally. He assumed various roles as a runaway slave and a courier, and this allowed him to navigate across enemy lines virtually undetected. His work gave Lafayette advance warning about the approaching British reinforcements, which in turn gave the Americans enough time to secure a blockade at Yorktown. So we hear Lafayette getting a lot of credit for the success and the victory at Yorktown, but James deserves just as much credit for that as well. After the war, Armistead petitioned for his freedom. However, unlike other Black veterans who were freed after the passage of the Act of 1783, Armistead's services were through espionage. They weren't through combat, which meant he was not eligible for his freedom. In 1784, Lafayette personally came to his aid, and he penned a testimonial confirming Armistead's services to his country and to Lafayette personally. And there is a copy of Lafayette's testimony on the right-hand side, but I will not make you squint and read Lafayette's handwriting. This is what it says. This is to certify that the bearer by the name of James has done essential services to me while I had the honor to command in this state. His intelligences from the enemy's camp were industriously collected and faithfully delivered. He perfectly acquitted himself with some important commissions I gave him and appears to me entitled to every reward his situation can admit of. Lafayette's words helped push Armistead's story into public consciousness, and James Armistead won his emancipation in 1787. As a sign of gratitude to the man who he worked for and who helped fight for his freedom, he chose a new surname, and he went by James Armistead Lafayette. James attempted to see Lafayette in Yorktown, but he was unable to raise enough funds to make the journey, so it was in Richmond, as Lafayette's carriage entered the city a few days later, that their reunion took place. Lafayette saw James in the crowd, and he immediately ordered the carriage to stop. He called out James's name and reached out to him, and these two men publicly embraced in the midst of this crowd. Around the same time, James also sat for the only known portrait of his likeness, which is the portrait here on the left-hand side. It is owned by the Valentine, an amazing museum in Richmond. And the artist was John Blennerhassett Martin. Even for free Black men in the early 19th century, this type of portrait is very unusual, and it's unclear how it happened, but it seems quite likely that Lafayette had a hand in the creation of this portrait. The portrait was widely distributed. It was used on broadsides with facsimiles of Lafayette's declaration of Armistead's war service, which you can see on the right, which once again spurred James's story into collective memory. But Lafayette's interaction with James is not the only instance of this happening on the tour. It's happening in many, many places, and it happens publicly and privately. At Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, Lafayette was overheard confronting his friend Jefferson on the issue of slavery. Israel, a man who was enslaved by Thomas Jefferson, later recalled Lafayette's passion for emancipation, with him even pointedly reminding Jefferson that the revolution was a fight, quote, for a great and noble principle, the freedom of mankind. By publicly and privately drawing attention to the institution of slavery and the people who were enslaved, especially in southern cities and plantations, Lafayette was making his position known, and he was trying to bring an end to the practice. These efforts ultimately failed, but they reflected the importance of small, meaningful action. Lafayette's status as the nation's guest placed him in a position where very few would challenge him, and instead of following the expected protocol, he used it to break the status quo. It's important to note that he did not make any grand sweeping lectures on the horrors of slavery. And he didn't lecture Americans on their moral shortcomings, but instead what he did was try to subvert these social rules and openly welcome people who were excluded. He didn't condemn people who disagreed with him, but instead he encouraged a conversation to happen. He used his celebrity to advance the cause of America's original purpose, a freely elected and representative government for all people. His presence also encouraged citizens to revisit these values of the revolution. I mentioned how people were kind of grappling with this mythology of the revolution. He's kind of encouraging people to start thinking about the values of the revolution and the concepts of what it means to be a free and equal nation. And Americans of all social classes, all genders and races, they found inspiration in Lafayette's democratic message. In Concord, Massachusetts, a group of farmers and mechanics, they were alongside their wives and daughters. They protested when they were turned away from a public reception with Lafayette in favor of more elite members of the town. In New Haven, Connecticut, organizers barred a group of women from a breakfast event with Lafayette on the basis of strictly their gender. Lafayette heard about this and he happily welcomed the opportunity to greet them. So when he becomes aware of these situations happening, he uses his status as the nation's guest and says, "That's not happening, come on in." These collective moments were not radical signs of social change, but they really helped to birth this movement of action that is going to drive the rest of the 19th century, from labor unions and social reforms and women's suffrage. There's a very, very famous photo of suffragists protesting outside the White House on the base of Lafayette statue in Lafayette Square, and they are intentionally protesting on the base of Lafayette statue for what he spoke for human liberty and equality. In the summer of 1825, Lafayette returns to Washington to close out his tour. He spends the last few weeks in America paying final visits to his friends and including additional visits here in Arlington to Arlington House. On September 6th, he celebrated his 68th birthday at a grand reception at the White House. And the very next day, a large procession accompanied him to the Navy Yard, where he departed America for the final time. Lafayette's farewell was an emotional one, with politicians, city officials, and residents crowding the docks with the hopes of getting one final glance at him. President John Quincy Adams delivered an address of gratitude for Lafayette, and it is a very, very long address, wishing him well on his journey home and hoping that he would be aided by, quote, "the shouts of unbidden thousands, which greeted your landing on the soil of freedom and have followed every step of your way, still resounding like the rushing of many waters from every corner of our land." Very early 19th century flourishy. 24 cannons boomed. Lafayette embraced the president, who was his friend of nearly half a century, for the final time. He boarded a steamship that would take him to the USS Brandywine, a frigate that was ordered to carry him home to France. Lafayette never again returned to America. When he died in 1834, he was buried next to his wife at Picpus Cemetery in Paris. But once the news of his death reached America, President Andrew Jackson ordered the same funeral honors and mourning that was observed for George Washington in 1799. Flags were flown at half-mast, members of Congress and citizens wore mourning bands, the chambers of Congress were dressed in black bunting, and mock funerals were held for Lafayette across the country. The impact that Lafayette left lasted long after his tour had ended. The most obvious connection is in the form of namesakes. In the wake of the national tour, there were a flurry of namesakes in the forms of streets, towns, schools, counties, even children. There's a spike in children being named Lafayette or Fayette during this time period, sometimes even girls too. George Washington Parke Custis was particularly inspired by the revolutionary nostalgia that Lafayette's visit ignited. Throughout his Lafayette's visit, he wrote a 5-part series entitled Conversations of Lafayette, which were published in DC area newspapers, and you can still read them online today. The national tour and Lafayette's connection to George Washington spurned a renewed national interest in the first president. And in 1826, Wash published the Recollections of Washington, which allowed the public to see for the first time a more intimate and family look at the first president. Wash was also seemingly really also inspired by Lafayette's passion for human liberty, and he throws his support behind causes of Irish and Greek independence during this time. Lafayette also had an impact on Custis's views towards slavery, though instead of emancipation, Wash initially favored supporting the colonization of freed African Americans in Africa, and he was an active member of the American Colonization Society in the 1820s. However, his stance starts to shift, and in his will, he wrote that each person that he enslaved were to be freed once his debts were paid, but no later than 5 years after his death. On December 29th, 1862, 5 years and nearly 3 months after the death of George Washington Parke Custis, those remaining in bondage through him were freed, and the executor of his estate, who put this into finalized this and set this off, was his son-in-law Robert E. Lee. For all the mutual love between Lafayette and America that the tour left behind, it would take some time before Americans would formally honor him with citizenship. And the states of Maryland and Virginia had given Lafayette honorary citizenship, but this was prior to the ratification of the Constitution. Congress itself did not make the necessary measures on a national level until 2002. When the joint resolution was signed by President George W. Bush that August, Lafayette posthumously became only the 6th person to have that honor. Although he was not an American statesman, his selfless assistance during the war, alongside his relationship with Washington, raised him to a status that very few ever achieved. However, unlike Washington, Lafayette holds a quieter presence in American memory. His portrait is not on currency, his legacy is not a capital city bearing his name, or a marble obelisk. However, though his accomplishments were great, he was a major general in the Continental Army. He was a statesman who was motivated by the concepts of human liberty and equality, and he was an outspoken supporter of anti-slavery causes that inspired thousands after him. So as we enter the last of this bicentennial year, it becomes, I think, quite obvious that we may be missing a Lafayette-like figure these days, someone who reaches across party lines and is universally adored and welcome. So as we spend the remaining of 2025 celebrating Lafayette's values, his passion, and his celebrity, I urge each and every person gathered here in this room and online tonight to reflect on this final question. How can those of us who are inspired by Lafayette's words and actions be the ones to continue his work today? Thank you.
Lafayette sounds like a pretty great guy.
Yes, he does.
Surely there was something wrong. Are there things?
There are things. I mean, no one's perfect. I always tell people I have a rule. I'm not allowed to love historical figures and I'm not allowed to hate them because I don't know them. I read their mail, but I don't know them. He's one that makes it kind of hard to follow that rule because he was so earnest. Of course, he made mistakes. Something that he did, which he was very passionate about, and he wrote to George Washington being like, I have this idea how we can end slavery. And it was basically setting up a free labor colony where he purchases land in French Guiana. He purchased several plantations. People are educated. There is no difference in punishment based on race, and there is no corporal punishment at all. And it was to set up for gradual emancipation after like freedom. And so that people would be set up with education and funds, people were paid, and they would be able to kind of take care of themselves outside of the institution of slavery. He's really, really, really passionate about this and writes to George Washington, and Washington kind of writes back. We'll talk about this more when we see each other because he doesn't want to put how he actually feels in writing. It's not a success, it's not a failure, because when Lafayette is imprisoned during the French Revolution, again, all of his lands and titles and holdings are stripped, so that land is taken from him and those people are unfortunately enslaved once again. What he does after this is he seeks reparations for the money he lost by losing these human beings, which is not a great thing to do. However, it's also, I objectively understand why, because he had lost everything during the revolution and French Revolution, and he needed money. He cheats on his wife multiple times, but he's also a French guy in the 18th and 19th century. But he doesn't have kind of like glaring atrocities as other historical figures do. He is one that I think he feels very 21st century, and he feels very earnest. I lovingly refer to him as America's golden retriever because he just wants to do good, and he wants to try very hard. Isn't always successful, but yeah.
You know where he stayed most of the time when he was in the Washington, D.C. area?
In the Washington, D.C. area, he stayed at City Tavern, which was owned by John Gadsby, which he owned. He was Gadsby's Tavern. Not during this, it's very confusing. He owned Gadsby's Tavern in Alexandria, then he doesn't. He moves into D.C. and then he takes it up again. But he owned a tavern in D.C. and he stays there for his like first kind of stint the majority of the time. He'll also stay at Tudor House or Tudor Place, and he'll stay, I guess this does count as Washington, D.C. if it's at the time at Arlington House as well. However, when he comes back at the end of the summer of 1825, he stays in the White House at that time. He was a little bit closer with the Adamses than he was the Monroes, but I think what more has to do with it is the fact that he was 68 years old and he was very tired and he was sick of being guests in other people's homes. And he just kind of wanted a little bit of privacy at that point. But there, unfortunately, most of the places he stayed outside of the house museums that still exist don't exist anymore. Yeah.
You know, one observation I made, just to start another question, is he's a bit of a risk taker in the sense that, like, Washington, as I recall, served in the French and Indian War and was almost shot, so it was very unlikely that he would have survived that, but he did. And likewise, Lafayette was shot, and probably most people don't survive that type of injury. And then he goes back to France and he's jailed, and probably more likely than not, he's going to die in jail, and he didn't. So that's more of an observation. Maybe like other major historical figures, he's a risk taker.
Yeah.
So, and I don't know that much about him. Like, he decided to go back to France, and it seemed like, did he just not know he would be putting himself at risk by going back eventually? Or was it just that that's his home and it was natural that he would leave America and go back to France?
He is given later in his I absolutely agree. He's a massive risk taker. And I think that's another thing that's very endearing about him is like, he just gives it his all. There were many, many, many times this man should have died. And he lives until quite ripe old age.
Yeah.
As for the second part, he has many opportunities later to come back to America, and it's really only during as the French Revolution starts to escalate that he's like, oh, I really got to get out of here. They also his wife sends their only son, George Washington Lafayette, under a fake name to America because they knew he was absolutely going to be a target, and he actually lives with the Washingtons at the White House, the presidential house in Philly, and then at the White House at Mount Vernon after the presidency. But even still, he continually repeatedly says that he is a Frenchman. He loves America, but he is a Frenchman, and his duty is to France. After the Louisiana Purchase, he's offered the governorship of the Louisiana Territory by President Jefferson, and he turns it down. He says, "Nope, I want to stay in France." So he keeps coming back. Because he really wanted to also, he saw what America could be and what America became, and he really wanted to see that in France. And he really does dedicate himself to that, which I think is another thing that makes him admirable too. Yeah.
Speaking of risk taking, can you talk about him surviving the shipwreck on the Ohio River?
So there was a shipwreck on the Ohio River, and he almost drowns. That's basically the summary of it. I don't have like the full details of that one off the top of my head, but it is a very dramatic story. I think that a lot of Lafayette's life lends itself to like movies. You could make a whole movie of just him 67 years old surviving a steamboat wreck on the Ohio River and getting to shore and then partying the next day.
I love because the college I went to was near along the place where he supposedly landed, but I saw there's several places that say this is where Lafayette is.
And like, they like that region specifically, because he did spend so little time there. One thing I find that's really cool about the tour, I love like local history is such a huge deep love of mine, something I've always cared about. And when you have like an event like this where it's like a guy traveling from place to place, like all these like local small areas really get the chance to talk about their own history and their connection to him, which is really, really cool. And that is like one of the regions where he was there so briefly, and it's still like, but he was here, he made it. And it's like, that's what made it. He visited all 24 states. That's what made it that. So
Did he meet with John?
yes, he did. He met with John Adams, and he met with Thomas Jefferson, and he met with Madison and Monroe. Any of the living presidents, he met with all of them at their homes. Yeah. Yeah.
How did his position on slavery evolve? When he first met Washington, how would you describe what he thought about slavery at the time of the Revolution versus the example that you presented about Armistead and his willingness to embrace this gentleman out in public and make a a public declaration of support.
Yeah.
for freedom.
Lafayette's relationship with slavery is something that I think is one of the most interesting things about him, because it shows how he educated himself and changed his mind when he was exposed to new things. The very first faces that Lafayette saw when he arrived in America in 1777 in Georgetown, South Carolina, were Black faces. The first people that attended to him were enslaved men. He had no concept. He is 19 years old. He really is like, his writings during this time are a classic 19-year-old. It's not until really after the war, when he goes back to France, he writes to John Adams and asks for information about like the cause of slavery in America. Who can I learn about learning more about this? That when he like regresses back from America in the 1780s is when this really starts to come about. He may have, it was a young enslaved man may have been bought for him or he purchased in Annapolis during the war. There are scholars who are trying to like really figure out exactly what that kind of connection is, but he was waited upon and had enslaved help during the Revolution, but it's not till the war is over that he's, I think, kind of that adrenaline dump kind of comes down and he's like, well, we just fought this war for independence and liberty. It seems like we're excluding a decent chunk of the population, that he kind of reflects on that, and then looks for books and literature to read, to the point that when he does come back in the 1820s, it's something that he's incredibly impassioned about, and he believes that it's a massive kind of hypocrisy. About 10 years after his death, an English abolitionist who quotes Lafayette as saying, like, had I known I'd be like raising my sword for the cause of the continuation of slavery, I would have never fought in the first place. That's a paraphrased version of the quote, but it becomes something that grows over time with exposure. And yeah, he tries to get Washington to kind of go on with his plan, as I mentioned before, with gradual emancipation. But I firmly believe that Washington's own stance on slavery changed throughout his lifetime. But I think Lafayette is definitely a contributing factor to that, because although we don't have transcripts of what they talked about when Lafayette came in 1784 to visit him for a few weeks, I have to imagine, based on the letters, that Lafayette was hounding him for some sort of answer and really trying to persuade why this was the right thing to do. The difficult thing, but right thing to do.
Yeah, I was wondering, you visited 24 all the states at that time. Who set up his itinerary, and like, was that an American thing or was that his thing?
There's no one answer. So when he first came, he was supposed to only be here for about 4 months. And then as he continues to visit, he gets more and more invitations. And so the trip just gets longer and longer and longer and longer. And he really refuses very few invitations to visit people. The citizens of Frederick, Maryland, like send him an invitation on Christmas if he would like to come visit on New Year's Eve. And he's like, sure, why not? I've never been there. And he like heads out to Frederick to see the new bridge that was built that they helped dedicate with him. So he had a secretary who helped kind of like organize his travel, but it was really supposed to be a much smaller tour at the initial outset of it that was similar to when he came in 1784. So when he came in 1784, which I didn't really mention, he was here for 4 months and he largely just visited the East Coast and kind of like the big players like Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, Boston, Baltimore. No, Washington didn't exist at that time, but he visited George Washington at Mount Vernon and Richmond, and that was really kind of it. That's what this was supposed to replicate, but then it just grew as everyone wanted a piece of the pie. Yeah.
Here from the chat room.
Okay. Is there any in the chat?
Yeah, we have a couple questions.
Okay. All right.
Elizabeth. One was, and I think you mentioned some of this, but you may want to elaborate on it. Was he imprisoned during the rule of Napoleon? What was he charged with?
So it was not, Napoleon comes to power kind of like as Lafayette is freed. He was held prisoner for, as a war prisoner, essentially. He was imprisoned in Austria, and it was basically kind of tit for tat for what the French did to Marie Antoinette. It doesn't like make sense but very little is making sense in Europe during this time from that kind of standpoint. But yeah, he's held in prison and he is like moved around a little bit, and the majority of that time is in solitary confinement. What is interesting about his imprisonment is that I mentioned his wife was spared from her execution during the French Revolution. As soon as she is freed, she hears her husband is in prison, and she goes to meet with the officials in Austria and says, "All right, well, can he get out?" And they said no, and she says, "Okay, can I be imprisoned with him?" And they were like, "What?" And so she volunteers to be imprisoned with him, and their two daughters are imprisoned with him in Olmütz prison, which is not a pleasant place. And the reason why she passes away shortly after their release is because her health took a massive, massive toll on their time in prison. She is a remarkable woman, and had she been alive during this time period, I'm sure she would have accompanied Lafayette on this tour as well.
Okay, and that's a great answer. We have another question, and by the way, Bruce loved your presentation, but he also had a question, which was Lafayette's education. Was he influenced by the Enlightenment and philosophers like Voltaire?
Yes, he is definitely a little bit on the younger end of the men who were influenced by the Enlightenment, which is this age of like larger like social thinking and what really brings about the American Revolution. He's definitely absolutely influenced by that. And he is also, it's a combination of coming up in the age of the Enlightenment or in the end of the age of the Enlightenment, and also being a teenager where you there's nothing you really have to do. He's a French noble. He is one of the wealthiest men in the entire country. He's a little bored. He has military training, and he meets King George III's brother, who was very pro-America. And that's when he first hears about the American Revolution. And he's like, I gotta do this. And so that's when he's a teenager and heads over. So it's a combination of age and the Enlightenment.
That's all the questions we have in the Zoom world.
Awesome. You had a question? Yeah.
I mean, we're Lafayette still having sort of a very positive view in American culture, even though it is quieter. And in many ways, sort of embodied the ideas of the revolution more than many of the Americans at the time. How was his role so limited? You know, even though it's all still positive, it's definitely not a very contained role in American history. Where do you think that sort of stopped?
Repeat the question. Like the Lafayette's kind of how his I'm trying to summarize.
How his image in American history is still so small despite being so large.
I think it's because he doesn't have a hand really in American politics. And I think how we kind of learn American history, it's really through like the lens of the founders, which I would argue he is classified as a founder. But I would also say like Baron von Steuben could also be classified as that as too. And he's kind of in the same camp where we really don't view him in the same way. It's really the men who were involved in the Constitution are really the ones that were like, okay, this is kind of where it starts. But I think we're in an age, especially now, and I would say the Hamilton musical helps, that we can kind of pull back a little bit and see that, oh, there's other people involved in this that have a major hand in doing this. And it's not just one group of men alone. There's a lot of men and women and a whole bunch of different people kind of contributing to this. And I think that's where he has kind of gotten a little bit more popular and kind of re-examined, I guess, because even there's not a ton of like scholarly work about him. Another issue with that too is because there's a lot of it in France. So then you also have this language barrier, which does make things a little bit harder. And French archives are not as accessible as American archives. So it does make it a little bit of a challenge. But I also think with technological advancements, those things are starting to change. So we're kind of shifting a little bit. Yeah.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It's been very, very interesting.
Thank you.
How many children did he have? You mentioned a son,
Mhm.
you mentioned 2 daughters.
He had 4 children. His oldest one actually, unfortunately, passed away when he was here in America during the Revolution. But then he and his wife have 2 daughters and a son, and they all live to adulthood. His son kind of tries to follow him in politics, but being the son of Lafayette is kind of a little bit difficult. So he doesn't like, none of them really. I don't want to say none of them do anything, because of course they're doing things, but it's nothing. Their Wikipedia pages are much smaller than his.
And he's very, and this is very recent here,
Yeah, he's buried in Paris. It's in a cemetery called Picpus, and it was a cemetery that his wife established for victims of the terror. And so it's largely nobles who were executed. And so that's where her mother and grandmother and sister were buried. And so she wanted to be buried there as well. And so he wanted to be buried next to her. And there is an American flag that flies over his grave that has remained flying over his grave for many, 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 many years. But it is a really small cemetery, and it's one that, like, if you go to Paris, check the hours on like Google Maps and make sure you're in the right plot space, because it's literally like a wall and a door, and you knock on the door, and then they tell you're American right away, and they're like, "Oh, here's your guy." Flag still flies, and it's overseen by the Rochambeau DAR chapter over there, so they take care of it.
We had
Yeah.
one short question that
Oh,
came in
okay.
just now
Yeah,
on
sure.
Zoom. This is from Amy. Did the Marquis ever spend the night at Arlington House, or did he just spend the evening?
I think he just spent the evening. I don't, the place that I know he stayed, I believe he stayed at Tudor Place once, and he stayed at Woodlawn a lot, which is great. I work at Woodlawn, so I get to like be in a place that he was. But he was there a lot. Woodlawn's also a little bit more isolated. I don't believe he slept at Arlington House because I think it was so close to Washington that it made it easier to travel back and forth.
Okay, and I just got another one, but you may need to spell this one out because it may be easier. But Janine asked, please write name in chat of the cemetery where Marquis is buried in Paris. But you may
Sure.
be able to spell it out or say
Yeah.
it slowly.
It is a Picpus, which is Picpus.
That's pretty easy.
Yeah, it's not like his full name, which is a mouthful.
And she replied with merci.
Merci beaucoup.
Which of George III's brother did he meet?
It's which of George III's brother did he meet? I don't remember his name, and I apologize. I don't remember.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm like half English, and I'm just like,
Okay.
they're all like the same names repeated. Oh, yeah.
And the other was, if you've seen the miniseries Franklin, and if so, what do you think about the portrayal of Lafayette?
I have seen the miniseries Franklin, and I love the portrayal of Lafayette. I find that there are very few, I mean, first of all, he's very rarely depicted in media, and I'm not someone when like I'm not a historian when I watch media and I'm like criticizing of it. I'm like, I'm having a great time watching my friends on TV. That's how I feel. But I felt like they did such a good job of capturing the fact that he was a kid. And like he had this kind of like pomposity and like bravado and charm. And I think that actor did such a great job. And I really enjoyed the depiction. So now hopefully Lafayette gets his own miniseries next. Awesome. Thank you guys so much. Thanks for braving the cold. Thank you online.